This story is from the Pooka Pages magazine, Yule 2020, by Lora Craig-Gaddis. Pooka and the Yule Thief, Part 1. "I think this is the last one," said Elsie. The little witch was a bit out of breath as she emerged from the attic of the cottage. She carefully set the cardboard box she was carrying next to the pine tree that now dominated their parlor. Pooka leaped on top and tried to claw it open. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "Then let's get started." Elsie laughed, lifted the cat off, and opened the box. She carefully unwrapped the tissue paper that surrounded a sparkling golden blown glass sun. "My great-granny bought this one year when she was in Germany," she said as she hung it on one of the tree boughs. "What about this one?" asked Pooka. His little paws were furiously pulling the tissue from the other ornaments in the box. "Careful, Pooks! Some of these are delicate family heirlooms." "Sorry." "That's okay. Have some more eggnog." Elsie lifted a silver crescent moon from the tissue. "This was a gift from Aunt Tilly and Uncle Tiberius," she said as she hung it on the tree. One by one, more ornaments were added to the tree, each with a special story or history behind it. Eventually, the tree was fully decorated. The beaded garlands they'd strung the night before were draped along the branches. Edgar, Elsie's crow, eyed the glittering garlands from his perch in the corner of the room. Elsie shook her finger at the bird. Leave them alone," she told him sternly. The witch and her cat sat back and admired their handiwork. Finally, Elsie announced that it was time for bed. "Okay, just a minute," said Pooka. He bounced out of her lap and quickly lapped up the last of his eggnog. Then, with a burp and a happy tummy, he followed her up the stairs to their bedroom. The next morning, Elsie went straight to the kitchen to start breakfast. Pooka, however, couldn't resist popping into the parlor for another look at the tree. It was still beautiful, but something was wrong. He stomped into the kitchen. "Hey, Elsie, you know that sun your great-granny got in Germany? It's gone, and so is the moon from Aunt Tilly. By the way, I hope you remembered not to put raisins in my oatmeal." The little cat hated raisins. Elsie turned from the pot she was stirring on the stove. "I remembered. And they can't be gone," she said. "You better come look," said Pooka grimly. Elsie did, and the ornaments had indeed vanished. They searched under the tree, behind the sofa, under the desk, and even checked the bookshelves and around Edgar's perch. The ornaments were just gone. After breakfast, their friend Nathan came by. Grandmother was making wreaths for the Christmas bazaar in the village, but she wanted you guys to have this one. He held up a pine wreath filled with mistletoe, pine cones, red holly berries, and a twig pentagram in the middle. "Yule wreaths are a symbol of the wheel of the year," recited Pooka importantly. He'd learned that from his lessons. "It's perfect," smiled Elsie. "Let's hang it in the window. Would you like some hot cocoa?" They were soon gathered around the wooden table in the little witch's kitchen with mugs of steaming, cinnamon-laced cocoa and plates of moist gingerbread in front of them. Nathan took a huge bite of gingerbread and moaned with happiness. These are so good," he said. Elsie flushed a happy shade of pink. "I add pieces of crystallized ginger along with cider-soaked raisins to the batter." "You added what?" Pooka hastily spit his out. Elsie threw back her head and laughed. "You ate a huge piece last night and loved it," she teased. Nathan laughed also. The cat glared furiously at them both, which only made the friends laugh harder. "I wish Grandmother was here," said the boy at last. "It might cheer her up." "What's wrong?" asked Elsie anxiously. "Nothing serious," Nathan shrugged. "She says some of her Yule tree decorations have gone missing and it's worrying her. But, she's getting on in years, and so she's probably just forgot where she put them. Pooka and Elsie exchanged looks across the table. The next morning, Pooka thundered into the kitchen. "Elsie, now the bee garlands on the tree are gone. What's next? Our presents?" The little cat whipped around and furiously began licking the base of his tail, which he did when he was very upset. Elsie stormed into the parlor. Her crow was on his perch, grooming his feathers before breakfast. "Edgar, did you take the garlands?" she demanded. The bird looked up and blinked. "No." Elsie frowned. She knew that crows were always cheerfully truthful, even when they'd been naughty. So, if Edgar said he didn't do it, then he wasn't the culprit. It was market day, and when the girl and her cat went to the village, they heard the same story everywhere. At the produce stand, the pharmacy, waiting in line at the post office, and even from the tables around them when they stopped for lunch at the cafe. Everyone, it seemed, was missing ornaments. Pooka saw the speculative gleam in Elsie's eyes as she toyed with her spinach and mushroom omelet. "You know who the thief is," he stated. The little witch looked up guiltily. "I have an idea," she admitted, "but I need to be sure." They finished their lunch, gathered their library books and purchases, and headed back toward Elsie's cottage at the edge of the forest. Pooka watched as the girl put away their groceries, then trailed after her when she headed toward her herb room. From a little chest on the shelf, she pulled out her pendulum and then lit a candle on the big wooden table. Perching on a tall stool, she dangled the pendulum from her fingers and frowned in concentration. The crystal began swinging. Pooka recognized it as the same spot where they usually had their Beltane picnic celebration. He suddenly remembered that there was also a very tall, majestic fir tree at the top of that hill. "Who's doing it?" asked Pooka eagerly. Elsie replaced the pendulum back in the chest. "Come on," she said. Pooka jumped down off the table and followed her out of the herb room. She threw her cloak around her shoulders, grabbed her staff, and stomped out of the cottage. Realizing that something was up, Edgar the Crow launched himself from a nearby tree and flew after them. "Where are we going?" Pooka asked. Elsie didn't answer, her mouth set in a thin line of grim determination. She headed toward the crest of a tall hill that bordered Farmer Gillis's land. "Oh," he thought, and then, uh-oh. As they approached the top of the hill, the tree came into view, and, sure enough, it sparkled and gleamed with the purloined ornaments. As Edgar landed on Elsie's shoulder, she turned to him and said, "Go get Thistle." The crow cawed in delight and launched himself into the air. Caw-caw! There was nothing he enjoyed more than intimidating fairies. As the cat and his witch approached the tree, a small gnome rushed out from beneath its lower branches, waving his stubby arms. "Stop! Do not enter, human! This is a sacred tree!" Scores of elves and several fairies appeared behind him. "The tree may be sacred, but the ornaments on it are stolen," said Elsie sternly. "Anything appropriated for the Yule tree is taken for the glory of season and the newborn sun," the gnome told them loftily. He planted his legs and folded his arms across his broad little chest in defiance. "The sun will bring warmth and life to the land. The sun deserves our best and highest honors. Everyone must sacrifice something to the sun." "But willing sacrifices," exclaimed Elsie. "These were stolen." The gnome shrugged. "So?" he smirked. "You humans think you own this holiday with your store-bought presents and fancy drugstore cards. But the winter solstice has been a special celebration of nature's cycle since the beginning of time," huffed the gnome. The elves and fairies behind him all nodded. Pooka flattened his ears and crouched low to the ground. His tail lashed back and forth angrily, but his witch gave him a look that said, "Leave this to me." "So why are you decorating nature's symbol of life, enduring through the darkness of winter with store-bought ornaments?" she asked. The gnome suddenly seemed less sure of himself. The elves and fairies all looked at each other, waiting for someone to answer. Finally, a fairy stepped forward and said, "Because they're pretty?" The others all nodded happily. "But you can make your own ornaments out of beautiful materials that nature provides," explained the witch. "You don't have to steal the human store-bought ones." "How?" huffed the cranky gnome through his whiskers. "I'll show you," said Elsie, "but first you have to return all the ornaments you took." "All of them?" asked one elf sadly. Just then Edgar arrived with Thistle the fairy on his back. She leaped off the crow and rushed over to the witch. "This wasn't my idea." "I know, but I could use your help in fixing it," Elsie smiled. Relief flooded Thistle's anxious little face, and then was replaced by determination. "Right." The naturally bossy fairy saluted smartly and then returned to the congregation. "Okay, forest folk, after you return these ornaments, we'll all meet back at the witch's cottage." "She's a witch?" gulped the gnome, turning slightly pale under his cap. One of the elves next to him dug an elbow into the gnome's well-padded ribs. "Duh! Pointy hat, magic staff." "But it's daytime. If we return them now, we might be seen," objected someone from the back. Thistle smiled sweetly. "If you're worried, I'm sure Edgar will be happy to assist you." The big black bird spread his great wings and cawed loudly, "Caw-caw!" Everyone in the little crowd suddenly began mumbling things like, "Nope, nope, we're good," and "kinda offer, but really not necessary." Thistle winked to Elsie, who grinned back, and Pooka snickered. Okay, that's the end of part 1. I wonder what's going to happen next. What do you think? You guys can go to Pooka Pages for pagan kids at pookapages.com. While there is a magazine which is free to download and share. Lora Craig-Gaddis makes a new one for each Sabbath. In addition to the magazine, there is a storybook chair with other Pooka adventures, a section for witchcrafts with Sabbath crafts and other fun pagan activities. There is a section for A Little Witchling's Book of Shadows, Elsie's Herb Garden for a budding herbalist, Pooka's Pagan Fun and Games with printable games, Pooka's Coloring Book with coloring pages, S-Bats for Kids for full moon fun, and The Kitchen Witch, which has recipes for the Sabbaths. You can also send Pooka an email. He loves getting emails from kids at pookachild@hotmail.com. Make sure that you get your parents' permission. And you can also find Pooka on Pooka Circle on Facebook. I'll see you for part 2.